So let me just give you a quick background on the book. I had been working as an architect for about 15 years, and I was very idealistic, and I sort of lost faith in architecture. I lost faith that architects could help other people. And I decided to go back to school and study psychotherapy and become a counselor. So I did a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I worked in a clinic in Philadelphia and then opened a practice in Toronto. And I did that for about 6 or 7 years. And then I had a kind of revelation. This revelation was, I realized I wasn't very happy working as a counselor because I missed design. And it was a surprise to me because I'd sort of given up. But I decided I would then try and get involved in teaching. And my goal really was to bring some of the lessons that I learned studying psychology into the studio. And I wasn't quite sure how that would work out. And I wrote a first book and then realized I wasn't really getting at what I wanted to say. And this book, which is mostly made up of stories, I feel a lot better about actually than the first book. It's not really promoting a particular style or way of designing, but I'm trying to tell stories about how challenging, how difficult it can be to be a designer and make decisions. So let me just take you kind of on a reflection into the contents of the book here. There's two things that I feel very strongly driving the book. One is my belief that the world is now designed, a sort of 21st century approach to say that I don't think we've been in a world like we're in right now. And I think the responsibilities of designers are vastly increased, even over the last 50 years. Because whether you're talking about the green belt outside of Toronto or a remote site like this, the fact that they don't design in some part of this site has to do, in fact, with design itself. Like the decision not to design, that's also design. So, first point, the world's totally designed now. And then the other thing that's really challenging, I think, when you study design, is I think designers have something to say. Just like novelists, just like filmmakers, just like poets. And it's a real burden now, because I think at one time there was an agreement about what something was. What's a museum? What's a house? Now we're not sure if we should have museums, or what's in the museum should be returned to the people who maybe created it. You have museums that are full of objects that have been stolen. So I think it's a burden to a contemporary designer to have to answer questions about what they're doing, because we don't really agree on anything anymore. And there's obviously a very fast-changing landscape in terms of what's right, what's beautiful, what's wrong, what's ugly. So I think designers have something to say, and it's never been more difficult to make a decision about what it is you want to say, which is, of course, I think what's on all of our plates. Next, please. So I want to say something about architectural education, because that's what I've been involved in for the last number of years. This is my diagram of what it's like to become an architect. And you start with something simple, and above the line is the product. That's the thing you pin up. And it gets increasingly complex. And the reason you can go from 1 to 2 is because we see you've done 1. 1 is overwhelming, and then because you've done 1, you can go to 2, and because you get to 2, it becomes overwhelming, you get to 3, and so forth. But that's just the product. For me, what's really interesting is what's under the line, which I think of as the process. And it's a far more complex and sort of mysterious thing. It has to do with what we're actually going through, not just the appearance, not the thing pinned up on the wall. So all the kind of insights and experiences below the line, I think, are really what we have to begin to bring into a bigger focus in terms of design. So if I think about design studio, I think it's far more messy and complex than the outline that you get, because you could start off feeling, strong physically and reasonable, mental health and, inspired even. And then all sorts of things are going to happen over the course of the 12 weeks that are really not part of the curriculum, but in fact, I think have an opportunity to be sort of allies in the creative process. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how this kind of red line intersects with all these different experiences that we go through, and how that can actually bring some authenticity to your voice, as opposed to avoiding these tumultuous experiences that inevitably accompany creativity, which, by its very definition is something we can't predict. So if I say to you that above the line is the product, I think the other thing under the line is the individual. And it strikes me that if we're always talking about how our buildings are going to benefit the individual, it seems to me we kind of leave the individual out in terms of our educational process. So I'm a little concerned sometimes when someone says, oh, this is a kind of green room, and because it's green, there'll be a certain kind of outcome that people will experience because it was green. And that may be true, but I think it's more complex than that. And the thing that interests me in thinking about this is, rather than try and predict other people's behaviors, maybe our own experience could be much more useful in making creative decisions and not left out of the process. So I'm interested in the kind of educational and creative value of the turmoil and the ups and downs of the creative process. So that means I want to say a few things about the individual in terms of how this works. So, this is a good starting point, because, right now it's 6:45, but though the offices on the East Coast are closed, I think somewhere in the world your kidneys are being investigated by somebody, your lungs, your liver, your intestines. One of the things about, I think, the contemporary world is we're putting a lot of energy into trying to figure out what a human being is, and this is on the grossest physical level. But right now, someone's working, in a sense, on your behalf. And that's just the physical level. I think we could say the same emotionally. In the 1970s, early 70s, someone began to catalog how the emotional world might sit as a kind of mandala of experience. And just as somebody's investigating your kidneys, someone's right now investigating your mood. There's non-profit organizations that are interested in anxiety and depression, trauma, and also the kind of positive emotional experiences, which in the 21st century, I think we're starting to pay much more attention to positive, not just the pathology of the human being. Why is someone thriving and in a state of trust or acceptance or joy? So these things are being studied right now. So even when you wake up and you've had a horrible night and you're not happy in the morning, you can console yourself by perhaps thinking that though I'm not feeling great, someone is investigating on my behalf my wellness. And that's going to just increase. So not only on the emotional level, I think just the brain itself, everyone has heard, of neuroplasticity and, the advances in trying to understand the brain. We've got the instruments now to really move into this. Where it interests me particularly, because I'm obviously not a scientist, is, even on a simple level, it has been proven that, an alpha state is a creative state. And most of our work probably happens, in a much more frantic environment. But I think it's very interesting to think about a library that would have the necessary equipment for us to actually shift into creative states. This isn't accidental, or this isn't, random. This is really a proven way for us to think about creativity. So to me, it's another one of those things that we in the 21st century have as resources, which you couldn't say of other famous times, say the modern movement. Even the act of creativity itself is being researched. As you sit sometimes frustrated by your work, know that someone is studying how to be creative. What is creative confidence? At 1926, is that the year? Yeah. I mean, this is sort of considered a basic and reliable guide to creativity, these 5 steps. And while they've been played with, I think essentially this is the model. So again, when we're thinking about what's above the line and where it comes from, I think we need to understand the kind of richness that's gone into studying what a creative state is and how we can enjoy it and how we can relate with it. And just going one step further, this Anders Ericsson's work on performance. You probably have heard of this issue of 10,000 hours being necessary to acquire some mastery. He's the psychologist who did the work on this and has influenced everything from Olympic divers to chess masters. The idea of repetition. So when we were upstairs talking about iterative development, what makes repetition valuable as opposed to just mindless repetition? And he goes into a lot of detail about the need for, in a lot of the levels he works at, a kind of coaching, where you bring awareness of what you're actually doing. And I would say this is a hugely underrated body of information I think would really be beneficial in the creative studio, is what exactly are we doing when we're sitting there trying to create something? So you may want to follow up with some of this work, but in the book I try and give examples of people who have gone through this cycle of creating and trying to bring more mindfulness to their work. Okay, at another level, I'm trying to move out from the body to less and less tangible levels. The issue of leadership and pro-social skills. We do a lot of group work, but we don't really teach how to be in a group, how to work as a group. And of course, once you get out of here, all your work will be in groups. You won't be working alone ever again, as you may in studio. So I'm really excited that this is now something being studied, which means it's going to become available in wider and wider circles of people. And again, I'm very optimistic that it will make a difference in how we actually approach the issue of design, because it's inevitable as we move into more complex problems with stakeholders that haven't sat at the table. You're going to be very involved in working in groups. So, if you're interested in this, someone like Peter Senge is a great fellow to look up. He's done some great work on resolving this level of question. So finally, I want to come to the kind of listening word, because the title of the book, Listening to Design, was something that came up quite strongly for me. It's sort of a personal, sort of funny story. My wife and I often go to the States to visit our kids. We're waiting at immigration, at Pearson Airport. We often have lots of waiting time there. It's kind of nerve-wracking. Everybody's nervous. The whole room gets nervous. So I'm just fantasizing about the questions I'll get asked. And, this is my fantasy. Where are you going? Say New York. What's the purpose of your trip? Visit our kids. How long will you be there? We'll be back Sunday. Then what do you do for a living, Mr. Levitt? I listen to design. And of course that would promote a long conversation. So it's never happened. But I think the thing that's interesting for me is, I'll just say this about listening. When I was studying to be a psychotherapist, we would have a class where we would have to role play certain situations. So I would role play that I was the therapist, and someone in my class would role play someone who was anxious, maybe someone who's depressed. They would be given a little script to start with, and then we would just interact. So the teacher would put a camera on me and a camera on the client, and then we would have to interact for 15 minutes and then watch ourselves and have it critiqued. So that was, for me, very challenging. It would still be challenging. But I think the idea of listening, the idea being that you have an ability to be present and make space for the other, made a huge impression on me. And when you meet someone who can listen, your whole world changes. And in fact, I think it's a very healing thing. So once I moved back into teaching, I began to realize that in my own work that the capacity to listen to the other was very related to the ability to listen inwardly to your own creative voice. How do you know you're really hearing that voice? Well, I think it's an issue that requires practice, and in my experience, the kind of development of that came working therapeutically and then realizing, well, if I turn that inwardly, I'm going to be listening to my own creative voice. And that started a big sort of journey for me, and I really like this simple collage here where the ears, which are up near the head because there's a big investment in the brain, the ear drops down to the heart, and it's like everything's going to drop down. And that's what I think begins this sense of authenticity. We're not working just here, we're actually bringing it down into the heart. Carl Rogers is a sort of hero of mine, a well-known psychologist who passed away a number of years ago, who just made a simple observation that I think has a lot of meaning in terms of the creative process, though he was referring, I think, to it in a more broader sense. The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, I can change. So often I find that the very act of getting stuck or not being happy with what I'm creating, is very difficult to accept and easy to spin out of control into repetitive kind of practices and thoughts. And again, in the book, I didn't want to say, this is the way it is. I'm just relaying stories that I have experienced personally, either my own process or people have shared with me. And for me, this is a very affirmative way to think about the whole experience of creating. So let me just dive into this a little bit about the creative process. I think there's an incredibly difficult thing that happens when you're trying to create, and that's you don't really know what you're going to create. Can you go back, please? Back. So the thing is, I think it's really important to acknowledge at the beginning that we don't really know what's going to happen. We're kind of listening inwardly. We're trying to get inspiration. The ego, which has been how we've gotten everything in our life, from a new pair of shoes to, get ourselves to an interesting city to study. The ego doesn't really solve this problem. If I say to you, let's have pizza at 6:30 and the pizza's in the lobby, we can get pizza at 6:30. But if I say to you, let's have a creative idea at 6:30, you're not in control of that. So the whole creative process, I think, is challenging because everything we've learned about how to get things doesn't really apply, which is why listening starts to be important, because we have a chance to receive something. And I think what I've noticed is over time, one can actually become confident that one will receive something. It's like, as someone said to me a long time ago, you have to know when to lead and when to follow. And I thought it was a beautiful way of thinking about this experience we have. Sometimes we're kind of driving the thing, and sometimes we have to sit back and be receptive. But the reception is what's crucial, I feel. Next, please. So these are some points that I've grown fond of in terms of describing this process. First thought's best thought, is a quote that comes from Tibetan Rinpoche. But I like it because I think the most difficult thing is starting. And I think we agonize over starting. I think it's better just to start. And if you start, you don't have all this time spent wondering how to start. You can invest in the creative process itself, which I have a lot of confidence in. So I believe in just starting and trusting that the process will actually do a lot of the work for you. And I'll say a little bit about that shortly. Then one perception must immediately and directly lead to another. That comes from Charles Olson, this American poet. And he was talking about writing, but I think it's very true. When something comes up, you work with it. You lean into it. How do you know it's worth doing? You probably feel excited. Your body's not going to use words to tell you this is a good idea. You may have a friend tell you or someone tell you, but your body can tell you. The mind must be loose. If we're not open, nothing happens. Not a thing. So part of that receptivity, that listening, and you can practice with a good friend sometimes, just listen without judgment to them, and you'll be experiencing the kind of attunement. You want to offer your own creative voice. You can practice with others without bothering them. You can actually serve, some betterment in your environment by just listening. And you'll also be educating your own creative capacity, I believe. Then take a friendly attitude to your thoughts. I mean, one of the most difficult things for me is just getting critical of myself when I'm working. And I have a tendency, if I'm working and not liking something in my environment, it can really become a toxic part of creating things. So I'm not saying get rid of that. I'm saying noticing that is all you need to do. And then you can begin to have a more friendly attitude towards your thought, which in my experience begins to move things. So, I've asked myself for a long time, what is creative confidence? Why is it difficult to feel confident about one's work? And the image that always comes to mind is a car wash. Not the washing part, but this part where the wheel is kind of grabbed, and as soon as it gets grabbed, this thing is going to go right through. And this is the creative process. And I feel like if you're willing to trust the process, you will go right through. And I feel that creative confidence comes from this, being willing to trust that you're actually going to go right through. The other thing I want to say something about is just the importance of play, which, part of that, of course, is not taking ourselves too seriously, but also a lighter approach. We're in a university, which is a very demanding institution. It values certain ways of working. You're here to train your mind. But that would not satisfy everything that goes on under the line that I started with earlier. And so I think the whole idea of being able to play is important. One example of this that happened not too long ago was a student who was really doing some incredible work. And every time I went to her desk, the work was just a bum in it. It was really great. There was nothing I needed to do. I was just watching how good her sort of work was. And I didn't know what to say after she showed me like 20 minutes of great drawings and models. I didn't really know what to say, so I half made up this question. I just said, what are you going to do next? And she paused a second and said back to me, I'm going to do a critical analysis of what I've created. And I tried to hide my disappointment when she said that. I didn't think she needs to do that at all, but that's what she said. So I just waited a second, and then I said to her, why? And then she waited, and I think she was surprised. And she said back to me, you mean I don't have to? I said, no, just keep going. And, she did keep going, and I think she surprised herself. So I'm not saying there isn't a role for critical analysis. Of course, there is a need to be able to think. But I think we undervalue the power that goes into creating things, which comes from play. And, one thing I noticed is that in this studio I had, we have to submit an outline of what we're going to teach months before. And I actually was kind of out of ideas, and I decided I would just say, you do whatever you like. But pedagogically, you can't say that. I said, I called it open studio. You can do what you like. And I was a bit nervous because even in TRD1 it can take, well, it can take months for people to figure out what they want to do and start generating the narrative. We would have 6 weeks. So I was a little concerned. The day was coming where everyone was going to tell me what they were doing, and finally we sit around the table, everyone shares the project they want to do. And I was amazed because everyone had it. Everyone knew exactly what they wanted to do. They had sites, they had programs. And I just, secretly sighed and was delighted. And I realized they'd probably been told what to do since grade 1. They haven't had a chance to tell somebody else what they want to do, really, in how many years would that be? 15 years. So of course they were ready. They built up this incredible charge. And I feel, it's very beneficial for people to get this opportunity because designers have something to say, and I think we have to let that experience really get larger for people. Next, please. So, 2 things that I've been very interested in this idea of the creative process is visualization versus active imagination. Visualization is something I would say like this. Visualize a red door on your house, and maybe you get an image of that. Active imagination would be sort of responding to a story that you might be telling yourself about your project, or you can just walk through the whole thing. You can experience the whole thing. Now, we don't teach this formally, but the thing that I think is incredible is when you become architects and you're sitting at a table with a banker or a client or someone from the city, someone who has jurisdiction over your site. This is the one thing they will not have any idea how to do. And in a way, we've learned it under the line from the beginning. And I think it's one of the great underappreciated skills you have and will acquire. And I've been able, through electives, to spend more and more time on this. And there's many dimensions to it. Now, what if you're not the kind of person that really wants to tell anybody about what you want to do? I think there's a fantastic alternative. And I think of it as an altruistic approach to creativity, where if you don't know what you want to create, you can just ask yourself, what would be helpful to others? It's completely honorable to do what would be good for others. Architecture has one component of just providing a service to people. And, I have shown this slide a few times, and I got a letter from a student earlier this year who, went on to another graduate program, but she thanked me for writing a reference, and then she said, I want to let you know that slide was what I used for the entire term to design my project. What would be helpful to others? So, now we get into a little talk about problems. One of my favorite topics. Here's the thing. I'm sure all of you have favorite architects, musicians, writers, filmmakers. All of them. Well, let me say, does anyone think anyone does not have problems? Your favorite musician, do they have problems? Your favorite architect, do they have problems? Problems are so universal that they're sort of outlawed from inclusion in what we do. If you have a toothache, your first thought is, I hope I don't have a toothache. If you get stuck, the first thing is to get extremely restless. But my own view of the problem, the role problems play in the creative process, is that they are going to enable you to go deeper and further in your work. If you get stuck, that's a message, not a punishment. A message that your work can go further and deeper if you let go of the part of it that says it's my problem. If there's a less personal relationship to the problem, just observing, I'm stuck, I think is a really fantastic moment in design. So the question is how to have a problem, not how to not have a problem, how to avoid a problem. Forget it. It's impossible. It's a kind of constant in the arc of creating things, but how to have a problem. And to me, it has to do with the relationship one has with listening inwardly, and also a kind of acquired experience of understanding that this is, like I said, I think of problems as messengers that are deepening our work for us. There's no other way for us to go further. We feel stuck. And then when we release from that, we've actually got the project operating on other levels. What interests me about it is if we're trying to design buildings where people will have a kind of resonance, because problems are universal, we ourselves have to learn how to work with problems creatively. That's something that's going to be in the environment. And so projects that have a kind of authenticity or a resonance with people, I think are always ones that have a special relationship to this. And I, some time ago began to think of different ways to have problems and ways to get stuck. These are just quotes from working, from listening to design. I would go home after a day of work and so what happened today? Well, I heard someone say I got stuck. I heard someone say I don't like my project. And I began to think, how are these messages to go deeper? And I went through all of them and saw their value in terms of deepening our work. For example, one of my favorites is I don't have anything. So if you get the chance to be doing a desk for someone or just a peer design experience, someone says I don't have anything, you go, oh, okay, what are you thinking about? And then we'll talk for like 20 minutes. And if you draw everything they're saying, you'll find that it's not that they don't have anything. They think or they feel or they're in a place where they don't value what they have. And so all of these to me became really ways into the creative process. Another example of this that I want to share is just the Japanese custom of mending broken pottery that started about 500 or 600 years ago. The pottery at one time was sent to China. Then a particular prince decided, no, we can do this here, and they used gold seams to make whole the vessel. And the repaired vessel became more precious than the one that hadn't been broken, because it stood for something really remarkable, which I think is the point of this little section I'm describing problems, that what comes out of it is actually a more resilient, capable, confident kind of designer and a different relationship to creativity. So wrestling, this came up in a thesis not long ago. Someone was using this idea of wrestling, which in the book I described how this image came to my attention, sort of in a kind of crazy series of events where I just found myself in the library kind of looking up what wrestling meant. And in this story, some of you may have heard me talk about it, the thing that I think is incredible is there was never a question of the figure on the left, the human, winning. Impossible. So what the interpretation of the story is, the angel wanted to see if the human being was willing to wrestle all night. Because if they were willing, then they would sort of win the prize. Not because they were victorious, but because they had demonstrated a kind of perseverance and a willingness to engage in something other than themselves, this other voice. So to me, it's a kind of, was a life-changing experience to really start contemplating the depth of this image. I'm just saying this in a slightly different fashion. This comes from the work of Carl Jung, the psychologist, who I found myself very involved in studying. And he, after the First World War, started to collect alchemical texts, which people felt had no value because it wasn't science. But he felt they carried the code of psychological process. And in discussing an image like this, there are quotes that discuss this in the following way. This figure represents the ego, the part of ourselves that we're conscious of. And its now turn to the other side. In other words, the sun's there, but the moon is here. So this is the unconscious, you could say. And for him, this was a signal that the ego was now willing to kind of look at a problem. Very difficult to do. In fact, one has to, I feel, renew and kind of reborn. The ego has to be reborn through this process of looking at difficulty. And his view was very simple. He said, as soon as the ego is willing to engage with the difficulty, the unconscious will actually help. It'll actually work towards you. So the idea would be, he would say, oh, you'll get a dream, or you'll have an inspiration, or you'll meet a person who has the right word for the sentence you can't write. That's because you've turned to the difficulty in a kind of respectful way. The ego is now not just trying to get things, but is willing to train itself to be more receptive. And, you know, I spent a lot of time looking at images. The first one is from Doré, but this one is a stained glass window in England where the angel's no longer really wrestling. It's a different kind of fight. It's actually a kind of fair fight with rules that, while both parties are separate, you can see it's more of an embrace. And again, I think this is really, you know, you're having a good day when you can lean into these problems and understand them on this level. So let me just finish talking about success for a second. You know, it's a funny topic that we leave out of education, but who here would like to be successful? You don't have to put your hand up, but who, you know, everyone would like to be successful. Now, you have to decide what that means, but, you know, I think it's very interesting because I look at this two ways. One is, and I would like to be successful also. I would like to be successful. But I think there's an opportunity to think about success differently. Because if the person next to you wants to be successful, the question I would ask is, are you okay if you are successful and the person next to you is successful? Or is your success the only success? And so I think it's very interesting to kind of shift this ambition we all have when we are sitting down to work. And that ambition becomes a little different. We're not just trying to be successful, we're actually hoping everyone's successful. You know, if I ran this school, you know, I would almost want to start a kind of way we approach the studio where we're actually hoping for everybody to be successful. Everybody in your row, everybody in your room. And if you allow yourself to just imagine yourself successful, and then just let that expand to the entire studio, I think you'd find a whole set of resources that would come into play and support your work. So this is my kind of overview of what I tried to do in this book called Listening to Design. And I actually enjoyed writing it, and I hope some of you will enjoy reading it. Thank you. Thank you very much.